The clash of steel echoes through the mist-covered hills as two armored samurai lock blades, their fate hanging by a thread. This isn't just a battle, it's a moment frozen in time, a glimpse into the fierce and intricate world of feudal Japan, where honor and power were forged in blood and strategy. But what if I told you this scene hides deeper secrets? Behind every swing of the katana, every decree of the shogun, lies a system so unique it defies comparison until now. Today, we're peeling back the layers of history to explore the rise of feudal Japan, not just as a solitary tale, but as a gripping comparative study against the medieval worlds of Europe and beyond. Picture this: while knights jousted in European castles, samurai were mastering the art of bushido, the way of the warrior. While lords and vassals negotiated power in stone fortresses, Japan's daimyo were building empires of loyalty and land, bound by codes that felt almost supernatural in their precision. But here's the twist: feudal Japan wasn't just a mirror of the West. It was a realm of contradictions where cherry blossoms symbolized both beauty and the fleeting nature of life, where tea ceremonies held as much weight as battlefield victories. What made this system so different, and how did it shape a nation that would one day stand as a cultural and military powerhouse? This journey isn't just about dates and battles, it's about unraveling the mysteries that set Japan apart. From the shadowy intrigues of the shogunate to the rise of the samurai class, we'll uncover how a land of islands and volcanoes crafted a feudal system unlike any other. Along the way, we'll pit it against the familiar feudalism of Europe, revealing surprising parallels and even more startling divergences. By the end, you'll see medieval Japan not as a distant legend, but as a living, breathing world of ambition, betrayal, and brilliance. So steel yourself, because history is about to get a lot more fascinating. The Heian period, that golden age of courtly elegance and poetry, was crumbling like a fragile scroll left in the rain. Behind the refined rituals of Kyoto's aristocracy, a quiet storm was brewing, one that would shatter the old order and give birth to something entirely new. As emperors and nobles lost their grip on power, the provinces slipped into chaos, and from this turbulence emerged a class of warriors who would redefine Japan: the samurai. These weren't just mercenaries or hired blades, they were men of discipline, bound by a code that elevated loyalty above all else. But how did these sword-wielding enforcers become the architects of a feudal system? The answer lies in the land itself. Japan's rugged terrain, with its mountains and narrow valleys, made central control nearly impossible. Distant warlords known as daimyo seized the opportunity, carving out their own fiefdoms where the emperor's laws held little sway. They built castles on hills not just as fortresses but as symbols of their growing dominance. And here's where the samurai stepped into history, not as lone wolves but as the backbone of these regional power structures. A daimyo's strength wasn't just measured in land or gold, but in the loyalty of his warriors. In return for their service, samurai received estates, titles, and something even more valuable: honor. But this wasn't Europe's feudalism with a Japanese twist. In the West, knights swore oaths to lords in grand ceremonies, yet their bonds were often as fragile as parchment. In Japan, the relationship between daimyo and samurai was deeper, almost sacred. Bushido, the way of the warrior, wasn't just a set of rules, it was a spiritual path woven with strands of Zen philosophy and Shinto reverence. A samurai didn't just fight for his lord, he was ready to die for him, to erase his very identity in service. This wasn't mere obligation, it was devotion. And then came the turning point, the Genpei War, a conflict so brutal it reshaped the nation. When the dust settled, the victorious Minamoto clan didn't just claim victory, they installed a shogun, a military dictator who would rule in the emperor's shadow. The imperial court still held its rituals, but real power now flowed through the hands of warriors. It was a quiet revolution, one that set the stage for centuries of feudal rule. The age of the samurai had truly begun, not with a single battle, but with the slow, relentless shift of an entire society's soul. In the heart of Kyoto, the emperor sat enthroned in splendor, surrounded by courtiers who moved through rituals unchanged for centuries. Yet beyond the palace walls, his power was like the moon, revered, even worshipped, but unable to command the tides. This was the paradox of feudal Japan's emperor, a divine figure stripped of real authority, his voice drowned out by the clash of swords and the whispers of shoguns. While European kings like France's Philip IV or England's Henry II ruled with iron decrees, Japan's imperial family became prisoners of their own prestige, trapped in a gilded cage of tradition. The difference wasn't just political, it was spiritual. In Europe, monarchs claimed power through divine right, but their authority was earthly, enforced by armies and taxes. In Japan, the emperor descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, making him not just a ruler but a living god. This sacred status was both his strength and his weakness. No warlord dared overthrow him, but none needed to. Instead, they left him wrapped in layers of ceremony, his divine aura perfect for legitimizing their own rule. When a shogun demanded obedience, he did so in the emperor's name, turning symbolism into a weapon. Compare this to the turmoil of medieval Europe, where popes and kings clashed openly over power. In Japan, the dance was subtler. The shogunate operated like a shadow government, handling wars, laws, and taxes while the emperor presided over festivals and poetry contests. It was a brilliant illusion, one that kept the peace for centuries. Even when rival clans tore the country apart during the Sengoku period, they fought to control the shogunate, not the throne. The emperor remained untouched, a silent witness to the carnage, his very irrelevance protecting him. Yet this system had a fragility Europe never faced. Because the emperor's authority wasn't just diminished, it was intentionally hollowed out. While European monarchs could rally lords under their banners, Japan's shoguns knew the emperor's word could still inspire rebellion if spoken freely. That's why his isolation was so carefully maintained. Court nobles, forbidden from leaving Kyoto, became experts in calligraphy rather than statecraft. Meanwhile, the real rulers, men like Tokugawa, Ieyasu, built their legacies not on bloodlines but on sheer cunning. By the time cannons and muskets arrived on Japan's shores, the emperor's role had crystallized into something uniquely Japanese, a sacred figurehead in a land where power wore many masks. Europe's kings would never have tolerated such a division, but in Japan, it became the glue that held society together. The emperor didn't reign, he simply was, like the mountains or the sea, a constant amid the chaos of human ambition. And in that stillness, he wielded a different kind of power, the power to endure when empires fell. The Minamoto clan's victory in the Genpei War didn't just end a conflict, it rewrote the rules of power in Japan. When Minamoto no Yoritomo seized control in the late 12th century, he didn't crown himself emperor or storm the imperial palace. Instead, he did something far more cunning. He became shogun, a title meaning barbarian subduing generalissimo that had once been temporary. But Yoritomo made it permanent, establishing the Kamakura shogunate in 1192. This wasn't just a new government, it was an entirely new system where military might trump courtly prestige for the first time in Japan's history. What made the shogunate so revolutionary was its sheer practicality. While the emperor's court in Kyoto remained steeped in centuries-old rituals, the shogun built his capital in Kamakura, a coastal stronghold far from the old aristocracy's influence. Here, surrounded by loyal samurai rather than poetry-writing nobles, Yoritomo created a government built for war, not ceremony. His officials weren't chosen for their knowledge of classical literature, but for their ability to enforce order across fractious provinces. Taxes were collected, lands were redistributed to loyal vassals, and justice was dispensed with brutal efficiency. The emperor still issued decrees, but everyone knew the real power flowed from Kamakura. This delicate balance between symbolism and force became Japan's political blueprint for centuries. In Europe, when warlords like William the Conqueror took power, they usually claimed royal titles outright. But Yoritomo understood something profound about Japanese culture. The emperor's divine status was too potent to discard, yet too impractical to rely on. So the shogunate became a shadow government, wielding power while carefully maintaining the illusion of imperial authority. Samurai swore loyalty to their daimyo. Daimyo answered to the shogun, and the shogun, at least officially, served the emperor. It was a pyramid of obligation, with the throne perched precariously at the top, respected but irrelevant. The Kamakura shogunate's true innovation was its legal system. Where European feudalism often relied on vague traditions and personal oaths, Yoritomo's government codified samurai rights and responsibilities in detailed land charters called shun. A warrior's claim to his estate wasn't just based on his lord's whim, it was documented, enforceable, and hereditary. This created stability in a land that had known only chaos. While European knights might see their lands revoked after a single battlefield misstep, a loyal samurai could trust his family's future was secure. This system of reciprocal obligations, protection in exchange for service, became the glue holding feudal Japan together. Yet the shogunate's greatest test came barely 50 years after its founding, when Mongol fleets appeared on the horizon. In 1274 and again in 1281, Kublai Khan's massive invasion forces threatened to overwhelm Japan. It was the Kamakura shogunate that rallied the nation's defenses, proving military rule wasn't just about internal control, it could save the country. The typhoons that destroyed the Mongol fleets were called kamikaze, or divine winds, but it was the shogun's networks of coastal watchtowers and rapid response samurai that bought Japan time for those storms to arrive. In that moment, the emperor's court could only pray while the shogun acted. By the time the Kamakura shogunate fell in 1333, the template was set. Future military governments, the Ashikaga, the Tokugawa, would refine the system, but the core idea remained. Japan would be ruled by the sword, sanctified by the throne. What began as Yoritomo's pragmatic solution became one of history's most enduring political experiments, proving that sometimes the most powerful rulers are the ones who never sit on the throne at all. The samurai stood apart from any warrior class the world had ever seen. Unlike European knights who often inherited their status through noble bloodlines, these Japanese warriors earned their place through mastery of steel and spirit. Their swords weren't just weapons, they were extensions of the soul, forged with rituals as precise as the movements of battle. But what truly defined them wasn't the edge of their katanas, but the unbreakable code that guided every breath, Bushido, the way of the warrior. Bushido wasn't simply a list of rules, it was a philosophy that blurred the line between life and death. Where European chivalry emphasized romantic notions of protecting the weak and courtly love, Bushido demanded something far more severe, absolute loyalty unto death. A knight might swear fealty to his lord, but a samurai's allegiance was so complete that ritual suicide, seppuku, was considered an honorable alternative to failing his duty. This wasn't just devotion, it was a sacred bond that transcended individual survival. The difference played out in their training as well. Young European nobles learned horsemanship and swordplay, but equally important were the social graces, music, poetry, and the art of courtly conversation. Samurai education, by contrast, was austere to the point of brutality. Beyond martial skills, they practiced Zen meditation to master fear, calligraphy to discipline the mind, and the tea ceremony to cultivate stillness amid chaos. Every aspect of their existence was a lesson in control, not just of others but of themselves. Land ownership revealed another stark contrast. European knights typically held estates directly from their king or high lord, creating a web of competing loyalties. But in Japan, the daimyo system created clearer chains of command. A samurai received land from his immediate lord alone, creating vertical bonds so strong that entire clans would perish rather than betray their allegiance. When European feudal ties often frayed over generations, Japan's system produced stories like the 47 Ronin warriors who waited years to avenge their lord's disgrace, knowing full well it meant their own deaths. Yet Bushido's most fascinating contradiction was its relationship with peace. As Japan's warring states period gave way to the Tokugawa shogunate's stability in the 17th century, samurai found themselves without battles to fight. Where European knights faded into irrelevance, Japan's warrior class transformed. They became bureaucrats, scholars, even poets, but always with swords at their hips. The code of Bushido adapted too, emphasizing moral perfection over battlefield glory. A samurai might never draw his blade in anger, but he was expected to live every day as if it were his last, treating each moment with the same intensity as a duel to the death. This evolution reveals the deepest truth about the samurai. They weren't just warriors, but the living embodiment of an ideal. Whether on horseback charging into arrows or kneeling in a quiet garden practicing ink brush painting, they carried the weight of their code in every action. Europe's knights left behind castles and ballads. Japan's samurai left a philosophy that still shapes the nation's soul today, proving that the sharpest blade isn't always the one that cuts flesh, but the one that carves destiny. At the very top of Japan's feudal pyramid stood the shogun, the military dictator whose authority outstripped even the emperor's symbolic power. But what made this hierarchy so fascinating wasn't just its rigidity. It was how every layer of society, from the sword-wielding elite to the rice-planting peasants, fit together like pieces in an elaborate puzzle. Unlike Europe's feudal system where kings theoretically owned all land, Japan's shogun ruled through a complex web of indirect control, trusting regional warlords called daimyo to manage vast territories in his name. The daimyo were more than just landowners. They were local kings in all but title, commanding private armies of samurai and governing millions through a mix of force and patronage. Where European nobles often inherited their status through ancient bloodlines, Japan's daimyo class was surprisingly fluid. A clever samurai could rise to become a daimyo through battlefield prowess or political cunning, as Toyotomi Hideyoshi proved when he climbed from peasant origins to become the nation's de facto ruler. Yet this social mobility had strict limits. The gulf between warrior elites and commoners remained nearly unbridgeable, enforced by sumptuary laws dictating everything from clothing fabrics to the types of wood used in house construction. Below the daimyo came the samurai, Japan's warrior caste, who made up roughly 7% of the population at their peak. While European knights often lived on scattered rural estates, Japanese samurai increasingly clustered in castle towns during the peaceful Edo period, transforming from battlefield fighters into salaried bureaucrats. Their stipends, measured in koku of rice rather than coin, tied them directly to agricultural production, a reminder that all feudal systems ultimately rested on peasant labor. And what of those peasants? In both Japan and Europe, they formed the base of the social pyramid, but with crucial differences. European serfs were bound to the land, unable to leave without their lord's permission. Japanese farmers, while heavily taxed, technically owned their plots and could even sell them in some regions, though escaping poverty remained nearly impossible. Artisans and merchants occupied an ambiguous middle space, despised by the warrior class for their profit-seeking, yet increasingly vital as Japan's economy grew. The starkest contrast lay in how these hierarchies were justified. Europe's system drew legitimacy from the church, with kings ruling by divine right and knights serving as Christian warriors. Japan's order sprang from Confucian ideals that valued harmony over individualism. Each person had a place, and fulfilling one's role with perfect discipline was itself a form of virtue. When rebellions did erupt, like the Shimabara uprising of 1637, they were crushed with terrifying efficiency, proving the system's resilience. By the time Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in 1853, Japan's feudal hierarchy had endured for nearly 7 centuries, longer than any European counterpart. Its legacy lingers even today, visible in corporate structures and social attitudes that still echo the age when a man's worth was measured not by wealth or talent, but by his precise position in an intricate chain of command. Kyoto burned. What began as a power struggle between two noble families in 1467 soon engulfed the entire capital in flames, reducing the imperial city to smoldering ruins. The Heian War wasn't just another feudal conflict, it was the earthquake that shattered Japan's fragile political order, plunging the nation into a century of bloodshed known as the Sengoku period. For 10 brutal years, rival warlords turned Kyoto's streets into battlegrounds, their armies trampling temples and palaces alike. But the real tragedy wasn't the destruction of buildings, it was the collapse of trust. The shogunate, already weakened, proved utterly powerless to stop the violence, exposing its authority as little more than a faded banner fluttering over a corpse. This meltdown mirrors Europe's 100 Years' War in striking ways. Both conflicts began as dynastic quarrels in Japan's case between the Hosokawa and Yamana clans over succession, in Europe between England's Plantagenets and France's Valois over crowns. Yet what started as elite squabbles soon spiraled into existential crises for the entire feudal system. Just as the 100 Years' War saw knights replaced by professional soldiers and castles rendered obsolete by gunpowder, the Heian War accelerated Japan's shift from ceremonial warfare to total conflict. Samurai no longer fought for honor alone, they fought for survival. As the old rules dissolved into chaos, the aftermath was even more transformative. With central authority in ruins, provincial daimyos stopped pretending to obey Kyoto. They fortified mountain strongholds, hired rogue samurai bands, and ruled their domains as independent warlords. Europe experienced similar fragmentation during its own feudal decline, but with a critical difference where European kings eventually reasserted control through standing armies and taxation. Japan's power vacuum lasted generations. The Ashikaga shoguns became puppets, their court reduced to hosting tea ceremonies while real power flowed to men like Takedo Shinjin and Uesugi Kenshin, who waged private wars with armies numbering in the tens of thousands. Yet from this anarchy emerged something unexpected: innovation. With no central authority to impose tradition, Sengoku daimyo became ruthless modernizers. They adopted European firearms after Portuguese traders, introduced them in 1543, revolutionizing warfare decades before most European armies abandoned longbows. They implemented land surveys to maximize rice production, creating proto-capitalist economies within their borders. Some, like Oda Nobunaga, even began dismantling the samurai's privileged status, promoting peasants to generals based on merit. In this crucible of violence, the rigid hierarchies of old Japan began to crack, proving that sometimes collapse isn't an ending, but the painful birth of something new. The Heian War's deepest legacy wasn't the battles themselves, but what they revealed. No system, no matter how ancient or revered, is immune to the tides of change. As Kyoto's ashes cooled, Japan stood at a crossroads, not between order and chaos, but between the corpse of one era and the uncertain promise of the next. The Sengoku Jidai wasn't just a time of war, it was a crucible that forged modern Japan. Picture a land where borders shifted like sand in a storm, where castles rose and fell within a single season, and where a farmer's son could rise to command armies that shook the nation. At the heart of this chaos stood Oda Nobunaga, a warlord so ruthless his enemies called him the Demon King, yet so visionary he saw beyond the bloodshed to a unified Japan. His story captures the essence of the Warring States period, a century where the old rules burned away, leaving only ambition and steel to reshape the future. Compare this to Europe's age of fragmentation after Rome's fall, when petty kingdoms rose from the empire's ashes. Both were eras of warlords and shifting alliances, but Japan's chaos had a peculiar structure. European nobles fought for crowns and titles, their wars legitimized by papal blessings or royal bloodlines. In Japan, power flowed to those who could hold it by sheer will. Men like Nobunaga didn't inherit their armies, they built them through cunning and terror, rewarding loyalty over nobility. When he marched into Kyoto in 1568, it wasn't to restore the shogun or emperor, but to declare himself the realm's unifier, answering to no one. The weapons of this revolution tell their own story. While Europe's knights clung to plate armor and broadswords, Japan's warlords embraced change with shocking speed. Just 20 years after Portuguese traders brought matchlock guns in 1543, Nobunaga fielded thousands of musketeers at the Battle of Nagashino, using volley fire to shred charging cavalry, a tactic Europeans wouldn't perfect for decades. This wasn't blind imitation, it was pragmatism turned into art, where European monarchs often resisted military innovation to preserve noble privileges. Sengoku daimyo cared only for what worked. Peasants with guns could topple samurai, and Nobunaga proved it. Yet the Warring States period's true legacy wasn't just in battles, but in how it transformed society. Castles evolved from wooden forts into sprawling stone complexes like Heian, designed to withstand cannon fire. Roads were built to move armies quickly, inadvertently knitting distant provinces together. Even the tea ceremony, once a monk's meditation, became a political tool. Nobunaga used it to court allies and intimidate rivals, turning ritual into strategy. Europe's feudal wars often left societies broken. Japan somehow made it stronger, forging systems that would underpin centuries of stability. The Sengoku Jidai finally ended when Tokugawa Ieyasu, Nobunaga's former ally, claimed victory at Sekigahara in 1600. But the period's spirit never truly died. It lingered in the Tokugawa shogunate's ruthless efficiency, in the samurai's transition from warriors to administrators, even in modern Japan's relentless adaptability. What began as a century of anarchy became, paradoxically, the foundation for one of history's most orderly societies, proof that sometimes chaos isn't the end of order, but its brutal midwife. Rising from the plains like a white heron taking flight, Heian Castle's graceful curves hide a deadly purpose. Its sweeping stone walls deflect arrows and cannonballs, while the maze-like approach forces attackers into killing zones where they'd be cut down from hidden loopholes. This wasn't just a fortress, it was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, designed to break an enemy's will before the first sword was drawn. Japanese castle architecture reached its zenith during the chaotic Sengoku period, evolving from simple wooden stockades into these sprawling stone and timber complexes that dominated the landscape both physically and symbolically. What made them so different from their European counterparts? Start with the foundations. Where European castles often sat on rocky outcrops for natural defense, Japan's flat plains demanded artificial mountains, massive stone bases called ishigaki that could slope up to 40 degrees, making scaling them nearly impossible. These weren't just functional, they were works of art, built without mortar yet fitted so precisely that not a blade of grass could slip between the stones. The iconic curved walls, or mushigishi, served dual purposes, deflecting projectiles while creating an optical illusion that made the castle appear taller and more imposing from below. Inside, the differences grew starker. European castles emphasized towering keeps for archers and boiling oil pots, but Japanese designers prioritized confusion. The approach to the central tenshu keep wound through multiple baileys and gates in a spiral pattern, forcing attackers to expose their unarmored right sides, since most warriors were right-handed while defenders rained arrows from flanking towers called yagura. Even the castle's interior was a death trap, floors designed to squeak like nightingales when stepped on, hidden compartments for ambushes, and sudden dead ends that funneled invaders into kill zones. Compare this to Europe's concentric castles like Beaumaris or Crac des Chevaliers, where layered walls created fallback positions. European warfare favored sieges and attrition, so castles needed to withstand months of bombardment. Japan's warlords, by contrast, expected lightning-fast assaults. Their castles were built to make attacks so costly that enemies would abandon the effort entirely. The materials tell their own story. While European castles relied on cold stone, Japanese builders used wood as their primary defense, those elegant white plaster walls. Fireproof coverings over timber frames, lightweight enough to withstand earthquakes yet resilient against flaming arrows. The layered roofs with their ornate gables weren't just beautiful, they created overlapping sightlines for archers while making it harder for fire to spread. Even the castle's placement reflected deeper strategy. Where European castles controlled trade routes, Japanese strongholds like Osaka or Edo Castle anchored entire cities, their sprawling grounds housing samurai districts that turned the fortress into a living, breathing capital. Perhaps the most striking contrast lies in their fates. While Europe's castles fell to gunpowder and centralized monarchies, Japan survived by adapting. When Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan, he didn't destroy his rivals' castles, he repurposed them, turning symbols of war into administrative hubs. The same walls that once echoed with battle cries now hosted tea ceremonies and tax collectors, proving that in Japan, even fortresses could find peace. The samurai knelt before his sword, not in prayer to a distant god, but in silent communion with ancestors and spirits woven into the very air around him. This wasn't just discipline, it was a fusion of Shinto's earthly reverence and Zen Buddhism's piercing clarity, two traditions that shaped Japan's warrior class in ways Christianity never could for Europe's knights. While medieval churches crowned kings and sanctioned wars, Japan's spiritual landscape offered something far more personal, a path where the divine lived in the swing of a blade and the stillness between heartbeats. Shinto, with its focus on kami, the sacred spirits inhabiting rivers, mountains, and even swords, gave samurai more than rituals. It gave them a sense of belonging to the land they fought for. Where European knights might dedicate victories to saints, samurai saw battles as reflections of cosmic balance, their victories or defeats tied to the will of unseen forces. Before campaigns, warriors purified themselves at shrines, not just for divine favor, but to align themselves with the natural order. A fallen enemy wasn't merely defeated, they disrupted harmony, and their death restored it. This worldview turned warfare into something almost sacred, where every action carried spiritual weight. Then came Zen Buddhism, arriving from China in the 12th century like a lightning strike to the samurai soul. Its emphasis on mindfulness and detachment resonated deeply with warriors who faced death daily. Where Christian knights confessed sins to priests, samurai engaged in zazen meditation, learning to quiet the mind before battle. The famous swordsman Miyamoto Musashi didn't just train with blades, he painted landscapes and wrote poetry, believing true mastery came from perceiving the world without illusion. European chivalry spoke of serving God. Bushido spoke of becoming empty, so the sword moved without thought or hesitation. The contrast with Europe's church couldn't be starker. Christianity's political power was institutional, with popes excommunicating kings and bishops ruling vast lands. Japan's religious leaders rarely wielded such direct authority. Buddhist monasteries like those on Mount Heian maintained armed monks, but they were players in the feudal game, not its arbiters. When Oda Nobunaga burned Enryoku-ji Temple in 1571, it wasn't heresy, it was strategy, eliminating a rival power bloc. Europe's investiture controversy saw emperors and popes clash over who appointed bishops. Japan's warlords simply marched through temple gates when doctrine became inconvenient. Yet for all these differences, both systems served the same purpose, justifying hierarchy. European nobles claimed divine right. Samurai pointed to Zen's acceptance of fate and Shinto's web of obligations. A peasant uprising in Europe was sin. In Japan, it was imbalance. The genius of Japan's system lay in its flexibility, where the church's rigid doctrines sometimes sparked rebellion. The blend of Shinto and Zen allowed warriors to adapt without losing spiritual footing. Even today, this legacy lingers not in dogma, but in the way discipline and devotion remain intertwined in the Japanese psyche, a silent echo of blades cutting through morning mist. The true power of feudal Japan's economy wasn't minted in gold or silver. It grew in flooded paddies swaying gently under the summer sun. Rice wasn't just a staple crop, it was the lifeblood of an entire system, the measure of a lord's might and a warrior's worth. Enter the koku, a unit equivalent to about 5 bushels, enough rice to feed one person for a year. But this wasn't mere sustenance, it was currency, salary, and tax rolled into one. A daimyo's strength wasn't counted in acres or coins, but in koku. His ability to produce and control this golden grain dictated everything from the size of his army to the loyalty of his samurai. Compare this to Europe's manorial system, where land produced wealth through a patchwork of crops, livestock, and feudal dues paid in labor or goods. European lords demanded days of work from serfs plowing fields, repairing roads, while Japanese peasants handed over a fixed portion of their rice harvest, often as much as 50%. But here's the twist: Europe's serfs were bound to the land, legally forbidden to leave without their lord's permission. Japan's farmers, while brutally taxed, technically owned their plots and could even sell them in some regions. This distinction created a paradox. Japanese peasants faced crushing poverty, yet their relationship to the land carried a flicker of autonomy unseen in the West. The koku system's brilliance lay in its simplicity. Every piece of arable land was surveyed and graded, its value calculated in hypothetical rice yields. Samurai received stipends in koku, not coin, tying their livelihoods directly to agricultural output. A mid-ranking warrior might draw 100 koku annually, enough to support himself and retainers, but not so much that he could challenge his daimyo. This kept the warrior class dependent on their lords, preventing the kind of independent knightly fiefdoms that fragmented European kingdoms. When Tokugawa Ieyasu redistributed lands after 1600, he didn't just reassign territory, he recalibrated entire clan fortunes by shifting their koku base. Europe's wealth, by contrast, flowed through more complex channels. A French noble might collect taxes in wheat, demand labor for castle repairs, and skim profits from village mills. Money increasingly lubricated these transactions, especially as trade revived in the late Middle Ages. But Japan doubled down on rice. Even as merchants amassed fortunes in silver and silk, the samurai elite clung to koku as the only true measure of value. This created a cultural divide. Merchants with chests full of coin were despised as vulgar, while a penniless samurai with a 200 koku stipend retained his status. The systems diverged most starkly in times of crisis. When famine struck Europe, serfs starved while lords ate, bound by tradition, but not by any precise calculation. In Japan, koku quotas meant famine years devastated the entire hierarchy. A daimyo watching his rice stores dwindle had to slash samurai stipends, who in turn squeezed peasants harder. Yet this very interdependence forced Japanese rulers to invest in irrigation, storage, and crop rotation innovations that stabilized yields over centuries. Europe's manners, for all their inefficiency, lacked this precise feedback loop between ruler and harvest. By the Edo period, the koku system had become so entrenched that it shaped Japan's isolation. With wealth pegged to rice, not trade, the shogunate saw little need for foreign commerce. Why risk destabilizing a system that had kept the peace for generations? Meanwhile, Europe's mixed economy propelled exploration and banking, planting the seeds of capitalism. Yet for 300 years, the koku system did something remarkable. It turned rice paddies into the gears of a machine that powered samurai, sustained castles, and kept an entire civilization in balance, proof that sometimes the humblest grain can hold up the weight of history. A single Dutch ship anchored in Nagasaki harbor, its crew confined to a man-made island no larger than a village square. This was Dejima, Japan's precarious window to the outside world during 2 centuries of near-total isolation. While European merchants crisscrossed continents, establishing vast networks that stretched from Venice to Beijing, Japan's shoguns deliberately severed most foreign ties, fearing the destabilizing influence of outsiders. Yet this wasn't a complete retreat, it was a calculated strategy, a delicate dance between curiosity and control that reveals just how differently East and West approached trade in the medieval era. Europe's medieval economy thrived on connection. The Hanseatic League linked Baltic herring fisheries to Florentine banks, while Venetian galleys carried spices from Alexandria to London. Trade routes weren't just commercial ventures, they were cultural superhighways, carrying ideas, technologies, and even plagues that reshaped societies. Japan's approach couldn't have been more opposite. After the chaos of the Sengoku period, the Tokugawa shogunate saw foreign influence as a threat to hard-won stability. Christianity, introduced by Portuguese missionaries, had already sparked rebellions like the Shimabara uprising. Worse, European traders often arrived with muskets and demands, turning commerce into conquest elsewhere in Asia. So the shoguns built a wall not of stone but of policy. The Sakoku edicts of the 1630s banned Japanese from leaving the country and expelled most foreigners, with two crucial exceptions: the Dutch, restricted to Dejima's cramped trading post, and the Chinese, confined to a separate enclave in Nagasaki. Even these privileged outsiders faced humiliating restrictions. Dutch traders were required to trample Christian icons annually to prove they weren't covert missionaries. It was trade on Japan's terms, reduced to a trickle under watchful samurai guards. Yet isolation didn't mean stagnation. Japan's domestic economy flourished, with rice brokers developing sophisticated futures markets and coastal shipping lanes buzzing with activity. While Europe's merchants risked piracy and fluctuating currencies, Japanese traders operated in a controlled, predictable environment. The lack of foreign competition allowed artisans to refine unique crafts, lacquerware, porcelain, and swords that would later dazzle the world when Japan reopened. The contrast with Europe's trade explosion highlights a deeper philosophical divide. Where Europe embraced risk and expansion, Japan prioritized stability and self-sufficiency. When silver from Spanish mines in the Americas flooded global markets, causing inflation from Moscow to Mumbai, Japan's closed system remained insulated. The shogunate didn't just fear foreign armies, it feared the invisible chaos of fluctuating prices and shifting loyalties that came with unchecked commerce. Ironically, this isolation bred its own form of globalization. Through the Dutch, Japan gleaned bits of Western science and medicine, creating a field called Rangaku, or Dutch learning. Maps of the world, telescopes, and even vaccination techniques slipped through Dejima's narrow gates, proving that no wall is completely airtight. By the time American warships arrived in 1853, Japan had spent 2 centuries observing the outside world through a keyhole, long enough to know both its dangers and its possibilities. In the moonlit shadows of Iga province, a figure clad in black slips through a castle's defenses, no clanging armor, no shouted challenges, just silence and a blade aimed at the throat of an unsuspecting daimyo. This is the ninja of popular imagination, the stuff of countless films and comic books, but peel back the layers of myth and you'll discover a far more fascinating truth. Shinobi, as they were truly called, weren't supernatural assassins in pajamas. They were masters of information, deception, and survival in an era where knowledge could topple empires. Unlike European spies who often operated as lone agents or under royal patronage, ninja were deeply embedded in the social fabric of feudal Japan. Many came from the lower ranks of society: farmers, monks, even failed samurai, who turned their marginal status into an advantage. Where a knight or noble would draw suspicion wandering near enemy territory, a peasant or traveling ascetic could move unnoticed. Their tools weren't exotic throwing stars or smoke bombs, but everyday objects repurposed for sabotage. Farming sickles modified into climbing hooks, hollowed-out walking sticks concealing poison, even musical instruments used to send coded messages across enemy lines. Compare this to medieval Europe's most infamous covert operators, the Hashashin of the Middle East. Both groups cultivated terrifying reputations, but their methods diverged sharply. The Hashashin relied on psychological terror, conducting public assassinations to intimidate rulers, often dying in the process. Ninja prioritized survival and deniability. A successful shinobi mission left no witnesses, no evidence, just a dead guard found days later with no visible wounds, or a storehouse mysteriously ablaze during a drought. Their greatest weapon wasn't the sword, but the art of misdirection, disguises, forged documents, and carefully planted rumors that could turn allies against each other without a single drop of blood. Historical records reveal ninja operating more like intelligence networks than lone wolves. The Iga and Koga regions became famous for their shinobi clans, offering their services to warlords as mercenary spies. A daimyo might hire them not just for assassination, but to map enemy fortifications, spread dissent among rival troops, or even stage elaborate hoaxes, like making an army appear larger by having the same torchbearers circle a hill repeatedly at night. Their manuals, like the 17th century Bansen Shukai, read less like combat guides and more like early textbooks on psychological operations, detailing everything from how to start fires with mouse dung to the best ways to exploit an enemy's superstitions. The Hollywood image of ninja as magical shadow warriors says more about our modern fantasies than medieval reality. In truth, their power came from understanding human nature better than their opponents. Where a samurai's honor demanded face-to-face combat, a shinobi knew victory often belonged to whoever controlled the narrative first, whether that meant framing an innocent man for treason or convincing an entire garrison they'd been cursed by vengeful spirits. Perhaps that's their most enduring legacy, not the myths of invisibility, but the uncomfortable truth that in war, perception has always been the deadliest weapon of all. Beneath the gleaming helmets and swirling clan banners of feudal Japan moved another force just as vital: its women. While European noblewomen were often confined to castles as political pawns, Japan's warrior class cultivated female figures of startling authority. Meet the onna-bugeisha, sword-wielding noblewomen who defied expectations. Tomo Gozen, perhaps the most famous, didn't just accompany male samurai into battle. She led charges during the Genpei War, her naginata, a curved blade polearm cutting down enemies with lethal precision. Historical accounts describe her taking heads like a seasoned veteran, her presence on the battlefield as unremarkable as it was terrifying. But women's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. Samurai wives managed entire estates while husbands were at war, overseeing finances, mediating disputes, and even organizing defenses during sieges. Hojo Masako, wife of the first shogun Minamoto no Yoritomo, became known as the nun shogun after his death, ruling from behind convent walls while pulling the strings of government with a political acumen that left male advisors in awe. Unlike European noblewomen who required male guardians to conduct legal affairs, Japanese women of the warrior class could inherit land, initiate divorces, and wield significant economic power. The contrast with medieval Europe is striking. Where queens like Elena of Aquitaine stood as rare exceptions, Japan's elite women operated within systems that tacitly acknowledged their agency. European noblewomen's primary value lay in their ability to bear heirs and secure alliances through marriage. Japanese clan mothers often dictated those alliances themselves. When the Taita clan faced collapse, it was Lady Sanjo who negotiated their surrender, preserving the family line through shrewd diplomacy rather than sword strokes. Even in death, the differences persisted. European noblewomen were frequently memorialized as pious saints or devoted wives, their tombstones adorned with passive imagery. Japanese noblewomen's graves often featured carvings of their personal weapons, a silent testament to lives lived with steel in hand. This isn't to claim feudal Japan was egalitarian. Peasant women still toiled in fields under backbreaking conditions, but within the warrior class, necessity carved out spaces of respect that Europe's chivalric culture seldom matched. The Tokugawa era's peace slowly eroded these roles, confining samurai women increasingly to domestic spheres. Yet the legacy endured in subtle ways in the hidden daggers Heian noblewomen carried for self-defense, in the matriarchal networks that still influenced politics behind painted screens, and most of all, in the quiet understanding that honor wasn't exclusive to those who wore men's armor. When modern Japan resurrected the image of the warrior woman in manga and film, they weren't inventing fantasies, they were remembering. A single no actor steps onto the stage, his carved wooden mask catching the flicker of torchlight, his slow, deliberate movements transforming into a grieving warrior, a vengeful spirit, or a drunken god with just the tilt of his head. This wasn't entertainment in the modern sense. It was a gateway to the supernatural, where every gesture held centuries of coded meaning. Feudal Japan's artistic brilliance didn't just mirror its society, it became the language through which warriors, monks, and peasants grappled with life's deepest mysteries. While Europe's Gothic cathedrals soared toward heaven, Japan's creators found transcendence in the whisper of ink on paper, the silence between drumbeats, and the haunting emptiness of a Zen rock garden. Take No Theater, that mesmerizing blend of dance, music, and allegory perfected in the 14th century, where European mystery plays dramatized Bible stories for illiterate masses, knows otherworldly tales of ghosts lingering with unresolved passions or demons trapped by their own hubris, served as meditations on karma and attachment. The props were sparse. A fan might become a sword, a letter, or a rushing river depending on the actor's movement. Compare this to Europe's boisterous passion plays, where elaborate sets and special effects like flying angels or helmets made the divine tangible. No demanded something deeper, the audience's imagination to complete the scene, a reflection of Zen Buddhism's emphasis on perception over illusion. The same philosophy shaped Japan's visual arts. A monochrome ink painting of a lone crow on a barren branch wasn't just decoration. It was a lesson in wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection and transience. Artists like Sesshu Toyo didn't merely depict landscapes, they captured the essence of wind in a few brushstrokes, leaving vast empty spaces that whispered more than the ink revealed. Meanwhile, Europe's Renaissance masters chased anatomical precision and linear perspective, their frescoes bursting with color and detail. Both traditions sought truth, but where Italians like Giotto celebrated human form and divine glory, Japanese monks painted cliffs disappearing into mist to remind viewers of reality's fleeting nature. Even architecture spoke to this cultural divide. Europe's Gothic cathedrals aimed to overwhelm flying buttresses, stained glass, and towering spires designed to humble worshippers before God's majesty. Japan's Zen temples embraced austerity, tatami-matted rooms with sliding screens that blurred the line between indoors and nature, where a single flower arrangement or scroll painting provided the only ornament. The Golden Pavilion in Kyoto might glitter, but its real power lay in the way its reflection fragmented on the pond's surface, an ever-changing illusion much like life itself. Yet for all these contrasts, feudal Japan and medieval Europe shared one artistic obsession: storytelling through craft. While French troubadours sang of courtly love in castles, Japan's biwa hoshi, blind lute-playing monks, chanted epic tales of the Heian clan's downfall, their voices rising and falling like battle cries. Both traditions turned history into myth, but where European bards embellished heroes' deeds, Japanese storytellers lingered on tragedy. The fallen warrior's last poem, the general who knows his cause is lost but fights on. It wasn't escapism, it was preparation. In a world where death could come as suddenly as a summer storm, art taught samurai how to die and peasants how to endure. Perhaps the most striking convergence lay in hidden symbolism. European painters hid biblical allegories in still life paintings: a wilted flower for mortality, a skull for judgment. Japanese artists did the same with seasonal motifs: snow on bamboo for resilience, cherry blossoms for life's fragility. The message was universal: beauty and meaning exist in the transient. But while European art pointed toward salvation in the next world, Japan's creations found holiness in this one: in the curve of a teacup, the grain of unfinished wood, or the actor's mask that changes expression simply by catching the light differently. Both cultures sought the divine. One built cathedrals to reach it, the other discovered it already present, flowing through every fragile, fleeting moment. The samurai's armor wasn't just protection, it was a masterpiece of mobility and intimidation, crafted to turn the wearer into something more than human. Unlike European plate armor, which encased knights in rigid steel cocoons, the yoroi was a symphony of lacquered scales and silk lacing, flexible enough to allow archers to draw bows while horseback, yet resilient enough to deflect arrows. Hundreds of small iron or leather plates, called kozen, were bound together with colorful cords in patterns unique to each clan, creating a shimmering, serpentine surface that rippled with every movement. The helmet, or kabuto, crowned this ensemble with sweeping crests, some shaped like crescent moons or demonic horns, designed to make warriors appear taller, more fearsome in the chaos of battle. Compare this to the Gothic plate armor of 15th century Europe, where knights became near-impervious tanks. Forged from single pieces of steel, these suits redistributed weight brilliantly, but at the cost of flexibility. A knight might need help mounting his horse, while a samurai could sprint and climb in his yoroi. The difference wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. European armor sought to neutralize threats completely, turning the wearer into an unstoppable force. Samurai armor embraced the idea of controlled vulnerability, prioritizing speed and agility over absolute defense, trusting the warrior's skill to avoid blows rather than relying solely on steel. Nowhere was this contrast sharper than in their signature weapons. The katana, with its curved, single-edged blade, wasn't just a tool for killing, it was an extension of the samurai's soul. Forged through a ritualistic process of folding and quenching, its steel attained a near-mythical balance of hardness and flexibility. A master swordsman could slice through bamboo or flesh with equal precision, the blade's curvature allowing fluid, slashing motions ideal for close-quarters combat. European longswords, by contrast, were straight, double-edged, and built for brute force. Designed to pierce chainmail or crush through plate armor, they required two-handed grips and wide swings, turning knights into whirlwinds of blunt trauma. Yet the most fascinating differences lay in their evolution. As European armor thickened, swords adapted, becoming heavier, some with reinforced tips for thrusting between armor gaps. Japan's battles moved in the opposite direction. When gunpowder arrived in the 16th century, European knights clung to plate armor, adding bulky, bulletproof breastplates until firearms rendered them obsolete. Samurai, ever pragmatic, lightened their yoroi, trading some protection for the speed needed to dodge musket volleys. By the Edo period, many wore only lightweight chest plates and arm guards, their katanas becoming more ceremonial as peace settled over Japan. The true genius of these designs reveals itself in their legacy. Today, a reconstructed suit of plate armor feels like a relic, a brutal, beautiful relic, but one rooted squarely in the past. A yoroi, with its organic layers and artful construction, still pulses with a kind of life, as if the warrior who once wore it might step back into it at any moment. One system sought to conquer physics with sheer mass, the other danced with it, turning limitation into artistry. Both achieved immortality, not in battle but in the imagination. The blade glints as it pierces the abdomen, not in desperation but with ceremonial precision, the final act of a samurai reclaiming his honor. Seppuku, often mistranslated simply as ritual suicide, was far more complex than mere death. It was a meticulously choreographed performance where every detail, From the angle of the knife to the composition of one's final poem carried symbolic weight. When the great warlord Takeda's Shingen's son Katsuyori faced defeat in 1582, he didn't flee or surrender. He opened his belly with a short sword, choosing an agonizing end over living with shame. This wasn't madness, it was the ultimate expression of a philosophy where personal existence mattered less than one's name echoing untarnished through generations. Compare this to Europe's honor codes, where dueling with pistols or rapiers served a similar purpose yet with striking differences. A French nobleman challenging an insult to his reputation might face his opponent at dawn, but victory meant walking away alive, his honor restored through bloodshed rather than self-destruction. The duel was about proving courage, not erasing failure. Even when death occurred, as in Alexander Hamilton's fatal encounter with Aaron Burr, it came at another's hand, not one's own. The European concept of honor focused on external validation, besting an adversary publicly, while seppuku turned inward, demanding the ultimate accountability from oneself. The ritual itself reveals deeper cultural layers. A proper seppuku ceremony required witnesses, often including a kaishakunin, an assistant who would deliver the mercy strike to the neck once the initial cut was made. This wasn't just about minimizing pain. It transformed death into theater, with the dying man's composure under unimaginable agony serving as his final testament to Bushido's ideals. When the 47 Ronin avenged their lord in 1703, their punishment wasn't execution but ordered seppuku, the shogunate acknowledging their honorable motives while upholding the law. Their graves at Sengoku Temple still draw pilgrims today, not as monuments to suicide, but to loyalty that transcended life itself. Christian Europe's view of suicide as a mortal sin created an irreconcilable divide. Medieval knights who fell from grace might endure penance or exile, but self-destruction condemned one's soul to hell. Japan's Shinto-Buddhist blend held no such eternal damnation. A properly conducted seppuku could even purify a family's name. This divergence speaks volumes. Where Europe's honor looked upward to divine judgment, Japan's honor radiated outward through community memory. Perhaps the most poignant contrast lies in their evolution. European dueling faded as courts and laws replaced personal vengeance, while seppuku persisted into the 19th century, not because Japan was backward, but because the act retained cultural potency. When imperial loyalists staged the Shishi revolts against modernization in the 1860s, many chose seppuku to protest what they saw as the loss of Japan's soul. Even in 1970, author Yukio Mishima's theatrical seppuku shocked the world precisely because the ancient rituals still carried weight in modern times. Two systems of honor, each mirroring the civilizations that birthed them, one designed to preserve life through controlled violence, the other to transcend it through perfect control. The battlefield at Sekigahara was blanketed in an unnatural fog on that fateful morning of October 21, 1600, as if the land itself hesitated to reveal what would become the most pivotal clash in Japan's history. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the cunning warlord who had spent decades surviving the Sengoku period's betrayals, positioned his forces not with reckless valor but with cold calculation. While European kings like France's Henry IV consolidated power through marriage alliances and decrees, Ieyasu's path to unification would be decided in 6 hours of bloodshed. By day's end, his victory didn't just defeat rival clans, it shattered the old order, paving the way for a dynasty that would rule Japan for over 250 years. What made Ieyasu's triumph so transformative wasn't just military might, but his genius for rewriting the rules of power. Where Europe's monarchs centralized authority by weakening nobles, think of England's Henry VII dissolving private armies after the Wars of the Roses. Ieyasu employed a subtler strategy. He redistributed lands to reward loyal daimyo, but always with strings attached. Those who fought against him at Sekigahara saw their territories reduced or relocated to remote regions, while allies gained prime holdings, yet all were bound by new laws requiring their families to reside in Edo, modern Tokyo, every other year. This hostage system, called Sankin Kotai, transformed feudal lords into political captives, their loyalty ensured not just by oaths but by the ever-present threat to their heirs. Compare this to Europe's absolutist monarchs, who often clashed directly with aristocrats. Spain's Philip II crushed noble revolts with sheer force, while Ieyasu Ko opted his rivals through bureaucracy. His shogunate issued detailed codes regulating everything from castle repairs to marriage alliances, turning the chaotic violence of the Sengoku era into a tightly controlled game of status. Daimyo could still wield power, but only within rigid boundaries, like pieces on a shogi board. The Tokugawa peace also hinged on economic mastery. While European kings taxed trade to fund their armies, Ieyasu monopolized Japan's gold and silver mines, controlling the lifeblood of feudal finance. He mandated rice taxes be paid in coin, forcing daimyo to sell crops to merchants, a move that quietly shifted wealth from warlords to urban centers like Osaka. Yet, unlike Europe's mercantile revolutions, which empowered a rising middle class, Japan's merchants remained socially inferior to samurai. Profit was tolerated, but never allowed to challenge the warrior elite's dominance. Religious policy revealed another stark contrast. Europe's 17th century was torn by the 30 Years' War, where Protestant and Catholic states slaughtered each other over doctrine. Ieyasu, fresh from unifying Japan, saw Christianity spread as a threat not just spiritually, but politically. After the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637, where Christian peasants rose against heavy taxes, the shogunate expelled all foreign missionaries and sealed Japan's borders. But where Europe's religious persecution often aimed at conversion or annihilation, Japan's repression was purely pragmatic. Hidden Christians could worship in secret if they posed no threat. Faith mattered less than obedience. The Tokugawa system's brilliance lay in its illusions. The emperor still reigned in Kyoto, his court performing ancient rituals, while real power radiated from Edo's sprawling castle. Samurai still carried swords, but their wars were now fought in law courts and rice markets. For over 2 centuries, this delicate balance prevented the clan wars that had ravaged Japan, proving that sometimes the strongest rule isn't the loudest, but the one that convinces everyone the old ways still exist, even as it quietly reinvents them. The Tokugawa peace wasn't forged on battlefields, but in the quiet corridors of Edo Castle, where shoguns turned political chess moves into an art form. For 250 years, Japan experienced an unprecedented era of stability under Tokugawa rule, not through overwhelming military might, but through a web of psychological control so finely spun that rebellion became unthinkable. At its heart lay the Sankin Kotai system, a brilliant piece of social engineering that transformed feudal lords into willing participants in their own subjugation. Every daimyo was required to maintain lavish residences in Edo while leaving their families there permanently as hostages when they returned to their domains. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was a masterstroke that drained rival clans' coffers through forced extravagance while ensuring perfect behavior through the ever-present threat to loved ones. Compare this to Europe's Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the devastating 30 Years' War, where European powers established a system of sovereign states agreeing to non-interference. The Tokugawa shogunate centralized power through calculated intimacy. Westphalia relied on treaties and balance of power. Edo operated through personal obligation and ritualized submission. European nobles retained true autonomy within their borders, while Japan's daimyo became glorified administrators, their every move monitored by shogunate spies disguised as gardeners or cooks. The economic consequences were equally profound. Where European monarchs taxed trade to fund standing armies, the Tokugawa system turned ostentation into a control mechanism. Daimyo, competing to impress the shogun with lavish processions to Edo, bankrupted themselves on silks and palanquins, leaving no funds for rebellion. The alternate attendance system didn't just prevent war, it created a nationwide network of well-maintained roads and post stations that boosted commerce while making troop movements easily detectable. Meanwhile, Europe's peace relied on ever larger armies deterring aggression, a financial burden that fueled colonial expansion. Japan, by contrast, turned inward, its isolation policy ensuring no external threats could disrupt the delicate balance. Cultural control completed the picture, where Westphalia allowed princes to determine their territory's religion but did little to regulate thought. The Tokugawa shogunate implemented a nationwide surveillance state. The Metsuke inspectors, who reported directly to the shogun, monitored everything from peasant grievances to daimyo dinner conversations. Village elders were made responsible for reporting suspicious behavior under the Gonnen-Gyumi system of collective accountability, creating a society where self-policing became second nature. Christianity was ruthlessly suppressed not just for doctrinal reasons, but because its loyalty to a foreign pope threatened the shogun's absolute authority. Yet for all its rigidity, the Tokugawa peace fostered unexpected creativity. With large-scale warfare eliminated, samurai transformed into bureaucrats and scholars, their martial ethos channeled into tea ceremonies and poetry. Merchants, though officially despised, flourished in cities like Osaka and Kyoto, developing sophisticated financial instruments that mimicked modern futures trading. Kabuki theater and ukiyo-e woodblock prints emerged as vibrant popular arts precisely because the energy once spent on battle now sought other outlets. Europe's peace-maintained armies, Japan's redirected human ambition into cultural achievement. The ultimate test of any peace is duration, and here, the Tokugawa system outshone its European counterparts dramatically. While Westphalia's balance of power collapsed into the Napoleonic Wars within 150 years, Japan's Great Peace lasted until 1868. When American warships finally forced open Japan's doors, they found a civilization that had perfected stability at the cost of stagnation, a trade-off that still sparks debate among historians today. Was it oppression or order, isolation or focus? The answer may lie in the silent eloquence of Edo's streets, where for centuries not a single castle fell to siege, not one daimyo dared raise his banner in revolt. In the end, the Tokugawa peace proved that control, wielded with precision, can be even more powerful than conquest. The first Portuguese ships arrived in Japan like ghosts emerging from the mist, strange vessels with towering masts and men whose pale skin and flowing beards marked them as utterly alien. It was 1543 when these traders anchored near Tanegashima Island, carrying muskets that would revolutionize Japanese warfare and a religion that would shake the social order to its core. Within decades, Jesuit missionaries like Francis Xavier had converted hundreds of thousands, from peasants to powerful daimyo, creating a foothold that alarmed the shogunate. But Japan's reaction to these foreign intrusions would take a radically different path from Europe's rush for global empires, a path that led not to expansion but to deliberate isolation. Where Spain and Portugal raced to carve up continents under papal decree, Japan's leaders saw Christianity as a Trojan horse. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 proved their fears right. Armed peasant converts, pushed to desperation by famine and taxes, seized Hara Castle and held out for months against overwhelming forces. When the shogunate finally crushed the revolt, slaughtering an estimated 37,000 rebels, the message was clear: foreign ideas could be as dangerous as foreign armies. The Sengoku Edict soon followed, slamming Japan's doors shut to nearly all outsiders. Only a handful of Dutch traders, confined to Dejima's artificial island in Nagasaki harbor, were permitted to remain, and even they were forced to trample Christian icons annually to prove their faithlessness. This wasn't mere xenophobia, it was geopolitical calculus. While European kingdoms bankrupted themselves fighting religious wars and colonizing distant lands, Japan watched from the sidelines. Spanish Manila fell to Dutch cannons. The Ming dynasty collapsed under Manchu invasion. The shogunate, having barely unified the country after a century of civil war, had no interest in becoming another casualty of global ambitions. Isolation became Japan's armor. Farmers were banned from building ocean-worthy ships. Japanese who left, like the castaways rescued by American whalers centuries later, were forbidden to return lest they bring back destabilizing ideas. The contrast with Europe's age of exploration couldn't be starker. Where Portuguese caravels and Spanish galleons crisscrossed oceans to extract gold, slaves, and spices, Japan's few authorized trading ships, the carefully monitored Vermilion Seal vessels, operated on a tiny scale, mostly shuttling between Nagasaki and Southeast Asian ports. Europe's empires grew fat on colonial plunder, but Japan's economy turned inward, thriving on domestic rice production and artisan crafts. Silver mined from places like Iwami Jinzen was funneled into the shogun's coffers rather than funding overseas adventures. Yet isolation didn't mean stagnation. Through Dejima's narrow gateway, Japan absorbed just enough Western knowledge to stay informed without being overwhelmed. Dutch physicians taught anatomy using smuggled textbooks. Astronomers tracked comets with imported telescopes. This trickle of information, known as Rangaku, Dutch learning, became a lifeline when American warships appeared in 1853, proving that no nation could hide from industrialization forever. The Sengoku period's true legacy lies in what it sacrificed and what it preserved. Europe's empires collapsed under the weight of revolutions and independence movements, their cultures forever altered by colonial encounters. Japan, by choosing isolation, maintained an unbroken thread of tradition that still informs its identity today. The same decision that kept it from global dominance also spared it the scars of imperialism, leaving a civilization that entered the modern age not as a fractured mimic of the West, but as something still unmistakably itself. The ink had barely dried on England's Magna Carta in 1215 when rebel barons forced King John to acknowledge their rights. But across the world in Japan, the shogunate's Buke-Shohato of 1615 took a radically different approach to controlling noble power. Where Magna Carta famously declared that even kings were subject to the law, Japan's legal code didn't limit authority, it weaponized it, transforming feudal obligations into chains of absolute control. The contrast reveals more than legal differences. It exposes the cultural fault lines between East and West. Take the treatment of inheritance. Magna Carta's clauses protected noble estates from arbitrary seizure by the crown, ensuring lands passed smoothly to heirs. But the Buke-Shohato dictated exactly how daimyo estates would be divided, often splitting them among multiple sons to prevent any single heir from becoming too powerful. Where European nobles fought to preserve dynastic continuity, Japan's warlords saw family lines as tools of statecraft to be pruned or grafted as the shogunate demanded. Even marriage alliances, so crucial to Europe's feudal politics, required shogunal approval under Article 3 of the Code, turning personal relationships into matters of state surveillance. Military restrictions underscored the divide. Magna Carta's provisions on feudal levies aimed to prevent kings from overburdening nobles with endless wars. Japan's laws did the opposite. The Buke-Shohato explicitly banned private warfare while granting the shogunate unlimited rights to demand troops. A European lord might refuse a king's summons if it violated custom. A daimyo who hesitated to answer Ito's call risked losing his lands overnight. This wasn't reciprocity, it was a masterclass in asymmetrical power. Yet the boldest innovation lay in social engineering. While Magna Carta's 63 clauses focused mostly on property and legal procedures, the Buke-Shohato's 13 articles seeped into daily life. Sumptuary laws dictated the fabrics daimyo families could wear. Castle repairs needed shogunal permits. Even the number of retainers allowed in processions was meticulously prescribed, turning displays of status into carefully measured performances. Where Europe's nobles guarded their privileges through charters, Japan's daimyo found their every move choreographed by bureaucracy. The punishment for rebellion highlighted the system's opposing philosophies. Magna Carta's Article 61 established a council of barons who could seize royal castles if the king violated terms, a check on tyranny but one reliant on noble solidarity. Japan's response to dissent was the Tokusei Edict, not collective bargaining but the outright annihilation of offending families. When the Shimabara Rebellion erupted in 1637, the shogunate didn't negotiate. It exterminated every trace of resistance, then rewrote laws to prevent future uprisings. Magna Carta assumed power could be balanced. The Buke Shohato proved it could be monopolized. Beneath these differences simmered a deeper truth about governance. Europe's feudal contracts were transactional, built on mutual, if uneasy, obligations between crown and nobility. Japan's laws were transformational, designed to remake society itself. The Tokugawa shoguns didn't just rule Japan, they redesigned it layer by layer until every daimyo, every samurai, even every peasant understood their place in the machine. Magna Carta planted seeds that would grow into constitutional monarchy. The Buke Shohato crafted a blueprint for total control, one so effective it kept Japan frozen in feudal stasis until steam-powered warships shattered the illusion 2 centuries later. Peasants in feudal Japan and medieval Europe shared one brutal certainty. Their lives were measured in sweat, hunger, and the whims of overlords. Yet when desperation boiled over into rebellion, the explosions took startlingly different forms, ones that revealed the hidden fractures in each society. Take the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637, where 30,000 starving Christian peasants and ronin seized Hara Castle under banners of crucifix and defiance. Their grievances weren't just about taxes, but about the very soul of their community under the Tokugawa shogunate's crackdown on foreign faith. Compare this to France's Jacquerie uprising in 1358, where serfs butchered nobles in their beds after the Black Death halved the workforce yet left feudal obligations unchanged. One rebellion was a last stand of identity, the other a class war drenched in blood. The spark for both uprisings was crushing taxation, but the kindling differed. Japanese peasants under the Tokugawa faced a ruthless fixed-rate system, typically 40 to 50% of their rice harvest regardless of drought or flood. When the shogunate suspected hidden Christian sympathies in Shimabara, it imposed additional levies to root out heresy, squeezing families who were already eating bark. Europe's peasants, by contrast, chafed under arbitrary fees. A lord might demand extra labor because his daughter married, or his hounds needed new kennels. The Jacquerie erupted not from systematic oppression, but from the sheer caprice of nobility who treated serfs as livestock. Religious fervor shaped these revolts in opposite ways. Shimabara's rebels flew Christian flags and carved prayers into wooden shields, their fight intertwined with the shogunate's ban on foreign faith. European peasant revolts like the German Peasants' War of 1524 sometimes invoked Protestant ideals, but more often the church stood with the nobility. Bishops owned vast estates worked by serfs. When the Jacquerie torched castles, they burned church records too, seeing priests as just another cog in the machine of their misery. The aftermath proved equally revealing. The shogunate's response to Shimabara was annihilation. Every rebel executed, their heads displayed on pikes. The region depopulated so thoroughly that newcomers were imported to resettle the land. Europe's nobility retaliated with equal brutality. Jacquerie leaders were hanged or broken on wheels, but their victories were never total. Serfdom eroded over centuries, its demise accelerated by the very rebellions that failed in the moment. Japan's rigid hierarchy, by contrast, only hardened after Shimabara, with stricter surveillance and even deeper isolation from foreign ideas. Perhaps the starkest contrast lay in their legacies. Europe's peasant revolts, though crushed, planted seeds of change, whispers of rights and representation that would grow into revolutions centuries later. Shimabara's martyrs became footnotes. Their rebellion used to justify Japan's locked borders for another 200 years. Both systems fed on peasant labor, but only one allowed the faintest crack in the feudal edifice, proving that desperation sounds different depending on who's holding the whip. The first cracks in Japan's feudal edifice didn't come from cannons or rebellion, but from something far quieter: rice brokers haggling over prices in Osaka's back alleys. By the early 18th century, the Tokugawa shogunate's rigid koku system was buckling under its own success. Cities swelled with merchants whose wealth mocked the samurai's rice stipends, while peasant uprisings multiplied as famine gripped the countryside. This wasn't decay, it was transformation, as an economy built on feudal obligations struggled to contain the restless energy of commerce. Compare this to Europe's parallel shift, where medieval guilds and manor lands gave way to stock exchanges and joint stock companies. But where Europe's transition was chaotic and public, think of England's enclosure, acts displacing thousands of peasants. Japan's unraveling happened in whispers, hidden behind the facade of tradition. The currency crisis of the 1700s exposed the fault lines. As silver flooded global markets from Spanish colonies, Japan's isolation couldn't prevent inflation from corroding the samurai's fixed incomes. A mid-ranking warrior whose ancestors lived comfortably on 100 koku now found his rice stipend buying half what it once did. Desperate daimyos secretly borrowed from merchants they publicly despised, while Edo's streets filled with masterless samurai forced to sell their heirlooms. The shogunate's response to basing coinage and mandating frugality only deepened the rot. Europe faced similar monetary chaos, but its emerging banking systems and colonial wealth softened the blow. Japan, locked behind Sakoku's walls, had no such pressure valve. Western ships steaming into Japanese harbors in the 1850s didn't introduce change, they accelerated it. When Commodore Perry's black warships anchored off Yoroga in 1853, their steam engines and Paixhan's guns symbolized an industrial revolution Japan had deliberately ignored. The shogunate's dilemma was existential: modernize and risk rebellion from traditionalists, or resist and face colonization like China after the Opium Wars. Europe's feudal decline had unfolded over centuries. Japan's would be compressed into decades. The final blow came from within. Young samurai, once the bulwark of feudal order, became its gravediggers. Men like Seigo Takamori realized their swords were useless against Gatling guns, their Bushido code irrelevant in a world of telegraphs and treaties. The Satsuma and Choshu domains, supposedly the shogunate's staunchest allies, secretly traded with Britain, arming themselves with rifles and cannon. By 1868, their coup toppled the Tokugawa in the name of restoring imperial rule, a revolution disguised as tradition. Europe's feudalism faded into constitutional monarchies and capitalism. Japan's shattered in a single generation. The Meiji Restoration didn't just end samurai privileges, it erased the social pyramid entirely, replacing daimyo with prefectures and rice stipends with government bonds. Last to fall was the sword ban of 1876, stripping samurai of their katanas and with it the soul of an era. Yet for all the rupture, something lingered, not in laws but in spirit. The same discipline that once guided blades would fuel Japan's factories and imperial ambitions, proving that even the most rigid systems never truly vanish, they simply change form. Walk into any Tokyo salaryman bar after midnight, and you'll witness an echo of feudal Japan that no history book could capture: rows of weary office workers in nearly identical dark suits, drinking away another late night at the company's expense. This isn't just modern work culture, it's Bushido dressed in polyester. The loyalty demanded by today's corporations mirrors the unbreakable bonds between samurai and daimyo, where promotions come not just from competence but from decades of unwavering devotion. The black-suited armies of Japan Inc., don't carry swords, but their pension plans and housing allowances serve the same purpose as feudal rice stipends binding them to the clan. Now contrast this with Europe's corporate landscape, where job hopping is expected and LinkedIn profiles read like mercenary resumes. The remnants of Europe's feudal past surface differently, in the aristocratic pomp of British boardrooms or German firms still carrying noble family names like Krupp or Thyssen. But these are relics, not living systems. A London banker might swap firms for a 20% raise without stigma, while their Tokyo counterpart would face whispers of betrayal reminiscent of a Ronin abandoning his lord. The threads of feudalism weave through Japan's social fabric in subtler ways too. Look at education, where the brutal examination hell leading to elite universities replays the samurai's childhood training regimen. Cram schools are today's dojos, forging not warriors but corporate foot soldiers through similar methods: rote memorization, sleep deprivation, and hierarchical respect for sensei over creativity. Europe's medieval apprenticeship systems evolved into vocational training. Japan's transformed into an academic arms race where, much like the Sengoku period's clan rivalries, getting your child into Tokyo University is the equivalent of securing a castle on strategic high ground. Even Japan's famed customer service carries feudal DNA. The deep bows, the reflexive apologies, the exacting protocols. These aren't just business strategies, but modern expressions of social harmony and status awareness that once governed interactions between peasants and samurai. When a department store clerk chases a customer into the rain to return a forgotten umbrella, she's upholding the same ethos that demanded a peasant kneel when a daimyo's procession passed. Compare this to Europe's service culture, where the Venetian merchant's transactional bluntness or Parisian waiter's assertive pride reflect their own feudal roots in bustling medieval trade hubs rather than rigid hierarchies. The most striking survival is in aesthetics. Europe's Gothic cathedrals and Renaissance palaces are preserved as museums, while Japan's feudal beauty remains functional. Tea ceremonies still unfold with Sengoku-era precision in corporate meeting rooms. Zen gardens grace bank headquarters. The minimalist elegance of a ryokan owes more to samurai austerity than modern design trends. Even the humble bento box, with its compartmentalized perfection, descends from the samurai's field rations, an edible metaphor for society's obsession with order and role. Yet this legacy isn't nostalgia, it's an ongoing negotiation. When Japanese millennials reject lifetime employment for gig work, or women sue companies over promotion discrimination, they aren't just challenging policies, they're hacking at the roots of a 700-year-old social tree. Europe's feudal remnants are tourist attractions, castles for weddings, titles without power. Japan's are operating systems still running beneath the neon surface, simultaneously fueling global dominance and cultural resistance. The salaryman's suit may look Western, but beneath it beats the heart of a warrior still loyal, still bound, still searching for honor in a world that no longer offers clean seppuku as an exit strategy. From the mist-shrouded castles of the Kamakura shoguns to the rice fields that measured a daimyo's worth, feudal Japan carved a path unlike any other. While Europe's lords and knights clashed under banners of divine right, Japan's warriors bowed to a code where honor outranked bloodline, and emperors reigned as living gods without ruling. Where European feudalism fragmented under the weight of church and crown, Japan's shoguns wove illusion and obligation into a system so resilient it outlasted its medieval counterparts by centuries. The differences weren't just political, they were philosophical. Europe's knights fought for land and salvation. Japan's samurai sought perfection in the swing of a blade or the stillness of a tea ceremony. The numbers tell part of the story. Europe's feudal age spanned roughly 500 years before giving way to Renaissance states and gunpowder empires. Japan's version endured for nearly 700, evolving from the Genpei War's chaos to the Tokugawa era's clockwork precision. But the real contrast lies in how each system harnessed human nature. Europe's feudalism thrived on competition, kings pitting nobles against each other, merchants breaking guild restrictions, serfs fleeing to chartered towns. Japan's stability came from control so total it became invisible. Daimyo financing their own surveillance, samurai policing the class that despised them, peasants internalizing obedience as cosmic order. Yet Japan's greatest innovation was turning weakness into strength. A figurehead emperor became the ultimate failsafe, his divinity so unchallengeable that shoguns could rule in his shadow without sparking revolt. Europe's monarchs, by contrast, had to constantly prove their legitimacy through wars and weddings. Even Japan's isolation, often framed as stagnation, was strategic, a refusal to play by rules set by distant powers. When the West finally forced Japan's doors open, it found not a backward relic but a society that had refined feudalism into an art form, only to abandon it with shocking speed when survival demanded change. So here's the question that lingers like incense in a temple hall. Could the Tokugawa system have endured another century without Perry's black ships? The answer may lie in the contradictions we've uncovered. A society that perfected control also bred the merchants and thinkers who dismantled it. A warrior class that clung to swords gave rise to the bureaucrats who made them obsolete. Feudal Japan's genius was its ability to balance change and continuity until the balance itself became the cage. What do you think? Could the shoguns have adapted to steam engines and telegraphs, or was their world destined to vanish like cherry blossoms in spring? Drop your theories below. The past isn't done speaking yet.